So for this section, we're going to talk about brain development in young adulthood. And we talked about brain development in adolescence and how that is the period of time where more brain development happens than at any other time other than infancy. So while brain changes in young adulthood are not quite as radical as they were in adolescence, much of the development that's stated in adolescence continues on into young adulthood, in fact, well into young adulthood. Remember, we talked about the prefrontal cortex is not likely to be completely developed until the mid to late 20s. So much of the development carries on, and the greater flexibility and vulnerability of the adult brain carries forward into those mid to late 20s. Improvements in executive functions, learning, and thinking continue into young adulthood, both resulting from and influencing ongoing brain changes. The susceptibility to the onset of major mental disorders extends into this stage as well. And so inhibitory control, the executive function that involves that stopping to think about things, stopping us especially from making a usual decision. So remember we talked about the Stroop game in week, I think 2, where the word would be a color word. So it might be red, but it might be printed in blue, and you had to say the color word rather than the color that it was printed in. That's part of that stopping to make a decision rather than the usual or the normal decision. And according to this research, this uses the prefrontal cortex and several other different cortical areas only on the right side of the brain. But when adolescents play that same game, both sides of their brain lights up. So that indicates that they have to use both sides of the brain, but by adulthood, it's only on the right side of the brain that lights up. So they believe from that those systems are more mature in young adulthood because the brain circuitry is not complete until early adulthood. Adolescents also don't do as well on those games as adults, and you would think that they would do better because they're more likely to be playing games and because they're younger and their brain is younger. But by age 18 to 20, most people have reached their peak physical growth. However, there are some differences. Some reach their full height by 15, and then others not until about 18 to 20. And sometime between 10 and 30, all of our biological systems peak. So by age 30, we have peaked in all of our biological systems. And at this point, we can see, hear, and smell as well as we ever will. It's all going to be downhill from that. Our skin is as firm and resilient as it will ever be. The potential strength of muscle and bone is as great as we'll ever experience. And our immune systems provide us with the most effective protection we'll ever have from diseases. And by diseases, I mean everything from common cold to cancer. The slide says that auditory peaks before age 20, and it may actually start to decline after that. And that visual acuity is about age 20 as well, and stays pretty steady though until about age 40, when unfortunately there is no exercise in the world to keep those muscles from dropping and your vision starting to decline. Believe me, I asked my eye doctor because he said, those muscles are just starting to not be as strong. And I said, so what exercise can I do to strengthen them? And he said, unfortunately, the best exercise in the program in the world won't stop this from happening. It's part of those aging processes. Some we can stop or slow, but some you just can't. So There's a difference in peak performance of athletic skills. This is a big thing that we've been talking about and hearing about in the news right now. These differences are affected by practice, training, knowledge, experience, biological capacity, exercise, and eating. And I find it interesting that those skills are based on muscle strength, that those skills that are based on muscle strength, flexibility, speed of movement, and response, those are the skills that tend to peak early. But skills that depend on control, that arm hand steadiness, precision, and stamina, those tend to peak later. So overall, it seems that the more the skill depends on cognitive factors in performance, like strategy knowledge and use, then the later the skill is going to top out. So while we know that biology plays a part, and regardless of activity, strength will begin to decline after age 30. Lifestyle also plays a role, and sometimes it plays a really big role. Regular exercise can help both younger and older adults maintain muscle and bone strength. And while when you're in this stage, it doesn't seem like, because you're healthy anyway, you're in peak physical condition, but the decisions that people make at this stage will follow them into the later stages. So the more muscle and bone density that they build during this stage, the more they will have to lose when they get older. Does that make sense? So those people who do not build strength in this stage may have problems in their later years earlier than those people who do exercise regularly and do build those muscles and bone density. Regular exercise can also help the cardiovascular and respiratory systems and keep them functioning well. On the other hand, like your book says, I'm going to blame it on the book, because smoking, poor diet, and little or no exercise can really accelerate that loss of peak cardiovascular and respiratory functions. So those are very important. They are much more important in my stage, that you kept them functioning at peak condition when you could. That will carry over into later stages in life. So, and like I said, it's also going to increase so no exercise or little exercise at this stage is going to increase the loss of muscle and bone at a later age. So I have to add that smoking also contributes to more rapid wrinkling of the skin, and that is not the world according to Tammy. That is what research says. And alcohol causes damage to the nervous system, the liver, and the urinary tract, and it appears that young adults are not much better than adolescents when it comes to risky behaviors, because in a study that was conducted by the Census Bureau, 41% of 20 to 24-year-olds reported heavy drinking and often binge drinking. And binge drinking in this study was considered at least 5 drinks in a row for men and at least 4 for women. And why is it important to you as a helping professional? Well, because while they are binge drinking, many young adults indicate that their drinking has caused them problems such as unplanned or unprotected sex, getting hurt, causing property damage. And also, did you know that studies show that binge drinking may affect the ongoing development of memory and learning abilities in both adolescents and young adults as well? So let me say this part again, because this is very important and you will see it on a test. A study conducted by the Census Bureau showed that 41% of 20 to 24-year-olds reported heavy drinking and often binge drinking And in this Census Bureau study, binge drinking, because it can be defined differently, but it was defined as 5 drinks in a row for men and 4 drinks in a row for women, at least. There could have been more, but that was the minimum to be considered a binge drinker. And this is important to you because while they're binge drinking, young adults indicate their drinking has caused them problems such as unplanned and unprotected sex, getting hurt, or causing property damage. So those are significant issues why they might end up in your office. And if you're a public school counselor, then parents with these issues, and we do have parents with children in school that are 24 or under. And so if their parents are still behaving in these manners, then some of the things that could be a problem is neglect or abuse of their children. So one study has linked being in college with substance abuse in the US because college students drink more alcohol and smoke more marijuana than same age peers who have never attended college. I don't know why. I'm just reporting the research. So, and also let's talk before we leave this slide about eating right. Failure to eat right contributes not only to obesity that we all know about, but it also contributes to depressed mood and to many other of those aspects of physical decline. And even if you don't see those other aspects of physical decline in this stage in life, poor eating habits in this stage will possibly result in type 2 diabetes by middle age. So things have changed. A century ago, less than 5% of all young adults attended college. That's a pretty small percentage. But today, more than 25% do in the US. So obviously college plays a large role in cognitive development for a large percentage of our young adults. And before we move on, I feel like it's important to mention that most of the research done on cognitive development for this age group is going to have been done in colleges. It's going to be research studies that were done in colleges. And so it may not translate to the general population as well as we'd like to think because it is done only on college students many times. So the greatest intellectual improvement during this age is the breadth of knowledge and the acquisition of knowledge. And so theories of cognitive shifts in adult years, Piaget ended his theory with formal operational stage, but many theorists have gone on and proposed an additional or 5th stage, which they call post-formal. And these are some of the ones who have suggested that post-formal thinking, and we'll talk about them a little bit more later. Qualitatively, this post-formal thinking is different from formal operations, just like what it says here. This is the ability to solve new kinds of problems that are ill-defined and ill-structured, and they often need to base solutions on not just what's best for them, but what's best for all concerned, and base those solutions on values and needs and goals, as the slide says. And so there's disagreement among theorists about the 5th stage in development of logical thinking. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that on this slide. So this is one view of adult theory and how they adjust. And so this theory emphasized the importance of new roles and needs and responsibilities in determining adult educational intellectual functioning. So he doesn't debate the post-formal thought, but looks at shifts in cognitive functioning and the use of knowledge and skills that are straightforward adaptations to the new demands that adults face at different times in their life. So, in this theory, we can think of the child and adolescent years as the time where they're solving simple problems and they're gaining as the acquisition stage where they can solve information, learn information, and solve small problems, um, whether it has any practical goal or social implications, like in school. Sometimes we teach them things that they don't feel like that has any application, even if we think that it does. And parents and others are responsible for the decision making at that point. Ultimately, they may make some small decisions, but there's somebody else who is responsible for the decision making. And many of the problems the child will learn have some pre-established answers. I mean, when we're teaching them the multiplication tables, that's always going to have the same answer. It doesn't matter. So that is pretty easy in terms of problem solving. You just have to memorize it. So young adults are at the achieving stage, according to this theory of cognitive development, where a person must apply those intellectual skills and the achievement of long-term goals. So they must pay careful attention to the consequences of the problem solving process. And this theory doesn't consider post-formal levels, but that the previously acquired skills are being sharpened and honed during this period by very different kinds of problems than what they've encountered up to that point. And so these very different problems, like we said before, are those ill-defined problems that sometimes have no right answer, no good answer. You just have to choose which of the situations or solutions that you come up with are the best. And for example, an adult who is considering a divorce. So in considering a divorce, I think that most of you, especially anybody who's ever gone through a divorce, would say that there really is no good answer, and they have to weigh out all of the different issues. So the person who wants the divorce's future happiness, what about the happiness of their children if they have any? And will they be able to support themselves? And those are just the basic considerations in that particular problem. And I bet that most of you guys could add more issues that would need to be considered. Who's going to live in the home, and can they afford? I actually knew a couple who put off a divorce for over 2 years because they didn't have enough equity in their house to be able to sell their home. And so they felt like they couldn't get a divorce until they had enough equity in their home to be able to sell it so that they could split the proceeds. So that was definitely not, if I was wanting to divorce somebody, I'm not sure that would have been a thing that would have stopped me. But in their situation, that was a consideration. So, and in this theory, each new stage brings new kinds of problems. And if you've gone very far through life stages, I think you can understand this. And they require different skills, or at least different skills play an important role with different stages. So in the responsible stage, which is that middle adulthood, ill-defined problems are still the norm, but now they're kind of something that we're used to. And they include not just your personal needs, but all the others that you become responsible for. And in middle adulthood, that may include your spouse, your children, your parents, many times stepchildren, or their other parent if you have stepchildren, co-workers, people that you work with, the community, what is best for the community. And you may just have a world of new problems and new responsibilities. And this seems to lead people to be more flexible in their thinking And then people who take on a supervisory functions at their work and in the community in this stage, um, they also extend the impact of their problem solving. And that leads to what we call here on the slide the executive stage. And these are middle adults who take on executive functions, have complex relationships that they must be able to view the problems from maybe all of their employees' viewpoint, or from the viewpoint of making a profit versus the environment and their shareholders and all of the other things that um, can play a part in that. And they also need to be skilled in conflict resolution for them to reach that executive stage. And then when people are a little older, what we call early old age, um, their children are grown up, and retirement sure becomes the uh, option and the um, problem, the thing that needs solutions. They they need the flexibility that they used in problem solving for creating a good environment for the rest of their life, and um, planning and managing their finances without work income. And so the focus tends to narrow again as you look at a changed set of more personal goals and needs, and less work responsibilities, less responsibilities for your children. And then responsibilities, they change with the retirement and the planning and the managing. And as people get even older in their elder years, they may not need to acquire new domains of knowledge or to figure out new ways of applying what they know. Many of those are motivated to conserve their physical and psychological energy. And they're frequently unwilling to waste times on tasks that are meaningless to them if it's not important. And their cognitive efforts are aimed more and more at solving those immediate practical problems that are important in daily function. And then there's also a legacy leaving stage in the elder years that may also characterize people whose minds are still very sound, but when their frailty of body signals that their lives are ending, sometimes those folks become very motivated to work on establishing some kind of a written or oral account of their lives or of the history of their families to pass on to others. Um, and while these require that they have those long term memories more than anything else, they also require some decision making or the use of judgment about what should and shouldn't be included in what's important. So, the criticism that we hear most about this theory is that it's focused on typical middle class experiences in Western cultures. And so it may not translate globally into other cultures. So that's probably the main concern that we see with this particular theory, because other than that, it is very well supported. So Perry's theory, his ran from 1970 until 1999, and it may actually be the oldest effort to examine the changes in thinking that characterize people as they transition to adulthood. And he focused on cognitive and more development in the college students. And so Perry identified 9 positions or stages that range from very extreme idealistic thinking to high levels of committed belief. And so these are outlined on page 440 to 443, and they're a very interesting read. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over them, although I think they're very important. Um, Position one, the strict dualism, has a very rigid adherence to authoritarian views. So they believe that the authorities knew the truth and we need to follow the authorities. And we do see that a lot early in young college students. I don't see that in any of you. I'm sorry. And they kind of have a childlike division of in group and out group, with the in group being right and the out group is wrong. And so uh, most of the people, really, by the time they actually get in college or have been in college for any time, are beyond this position one, um, and are more into these positions here. And so positions, this last position is what we usually see many times by the time they're leaving college or in graduate work. And so position 7 and 8 are commitment positions, with changes in thinking from those earlier positions that are more qualitative than they really are structural. And position 9 is about resolve. And in this instance, a state of courageous resolve to change the world. Okay, so really to continue the work of reflecting on one's commitment through adulthood to change the world. Um, and some more current work by some other researchers, Yoder, Mancha, and Smith from 2014, found that students in the latter years of college are more willing to attend to information that violates their own beliefs than those first year students. Those first year students, they will just shut it down because they have such, still have pretty rigid um, ideas that one thing is right, rather than being willing to consider that maybe there's more than one right decision. So some decision-making models, or decision-making models in general, are important. And some decision-making models have some common steps, including these that are outlined here. And I think that they are important to you as a helping professional, because it can be useful to use with students or with clients, whichever you have. But it's important to remember that it may also suggest to them, especially if you're working with high school students or even middle school students, that the problem is well defined. And we've just talked about the fact that by the time they're in young adulthood and middle, and many times before that, they're dealing with problems that don't necessarily have a clear-cut answer. And so most problems are not really well-defined problems. And so when you talk to a student or a client about defining the problem, um, they believe that, or could believe that indicates that there's a correct solution. Does that make sense? And there's not always. So if only they could just figure out the right answer. And I see that sometimes even with you guys, when I give you a more opinion-based, I guess, discussion board, sometimes if I'm not careful to say that there is no right answer, many of you are looking for that right answer, even though there is no right answer. It's just what you think. And so, based on the facts. And so, I think that we need to make sure that they understand that almost any solution is going to incorporate some kind of a compromise with some good and some bad. So, and it's important to consider the client's belief about the nature of the knowledge. So you need to be able to see that issue or that problem through your client's eyes by um, understanding how they view truth and how they view knowledge and the meaning of life. And we've talked about this, especially in this week's discussion board. That's kind of one of the things that you're doing, is is looking at how different stages, what they know, what they understand. And so it's important for you to be able to do that, to understand how they view truth, how they view knowledge, and what they can actually understand. So if the client views the world in absolute terms, then he or she may not even understand why there's a need to consider alternate solutions, because they're going to believe that there's right and wrong, that there's only one solution. And so that's something that you have to keep in mind when you're working with them. Of course, from even early childhood, we try to teach children to do critical thinking, to think critically, but still many college students begin college without even basic critical thinking skills. So I don't know how that comes about, and maybe it's because they're just not able to do that critical thinking until that age. But the slide points out ways to help develop those skills with your students or your clients, and I think it's worth our time to always work to continue to develop those critical thinking skills, because they're just so important. So while I know that you guys have the ability to think critically, research shows that people tend to be able to do that better when there's an explicit connection between subject matter and their lives. And so that's why many or most of the discussion boards in this class either connects it with your own life or with a student that you might be counseling, or in some way try to make that information relevant to you so that you will remember it and it will stay with you longer. And so I know that as school counselors, it's sometimes hard to provide interventions that last for a really long time, but there has been a significant amount of research that shows that sometimes it's better to work with a student for a longer time initially than it is to keep working with them for a short time every year as they move through the system, because you haven't really helped them acquire the skills that they need initially. And so, as the slide says, for clients with rigid belief systems, sometimes you have to balance support and challenge or facilitates more cognitively complex thinking. I'm going to go ahead and go with this, although I probably should stop. But as the slide says, procrastination, especially at this age, may relate to, and really perhaps at any age, but it may relate to fear, anxiety, perfectionism, or poor planning, disorganization, and lack of self-regulation. In early adulthood, individuals are no longer bound by those externally controlling routines of home and school, and parents are in charge. And even if they're in college, there's nobody getting them up in the mornings and getting them out the door. And that can, while it's really exciting, it can also cause extreme anxiety and be very frightening. And young adults may actually struggle with those large blocks of unstructured time that they now have, that before they were expected by their parents or other caregivers or the school to be doing something. And so I can't tell you how many times I saw students over the years that made a 30 or better on their ACT, but failed out of college the first year because they were used to that parent being in charge of their life. And many of those children were high achievers and had lots of extracurricular activities. And they were used to having every minute of their day structured by parents and teachers and their extracurricular activities. And so now they're in a dorm and they have a TV and they have a phone and a laptop. And all they have to do is go to these 5 classes for an hour a couple of times a week. And while those are on certain days and times, if they don't show up, nobody comes to get them. and their parents don't yell at them. And so, strangely, a teenager who may have managed it all in high school may not be able to manage to make it to class, or may not be able to manage to turn in any of their assignments. And according to your book, this procrastination is a very multidimensional construct that may have motivational, behavioral, cognitive, and personality components, and may be the end product of some very diverse pathways. But researchers have found that procrastinators share um, a, a trait in common. Um, they have low levels of conscientiousness. And so that seems to be the one thing that all procrastinators share. So if you um, want to remember that, I would suggest really that you do, because this may be something that you see on a test, is that procrastinators share a trait in common. They have low levels of conscientiousness, and they're more likely to be disorganized. They're more likely to be poor at planning and lacking the self-regulation needed to accomplish things in a timely manner. I know that you're probably saying, oh, yeah, I know that student. Yeah, I know them. And you probably do. And so I wish I actually had access to the Big Five personality test, because I think it would help you understand what I'm going to talk about next. But since I don't, let's just soldier on. Within these groups, there's some subtypes, and it's important to know about these subtypes so that you know what kinds of things can help them, will motivate them, whatever. There are those with low levels of conscientiousness and high levels of neuroticism. And so those tend to be very fearful, very anxiety prone, and very perfectionist. So you may actually have seen some of these in your high school students as well. And somebody was telling me that they gave the Big Five test. And I think that's just so awesome. I really would like to see every high school teacher, every high school give that Big Five test to their students, so that the students themselves have more of an understanding of why they do some of the things they do. These people who are perfectionist procrastinators, they actually have a code that they abide by. They call in research, it's called the procrastinator's code. And that is the specific cognitive tendency to equate failure in one area with a generalized sense of failure in all areas and with all aspects of themselves. So if they can't do whatever is within their unrealistic set of perfectionist standards, and they have this irrational belief, and mainly their irrational belief is that failure is a fate worse than death. And that may actually fuel their avoidant personality. So if you're working with students or clients with those kinds of issues, then what you have to do is attack those irrational beliefs. So you failed a test, or you didn't turn in an assignment. What is the worst thing that will happen? And they may tell you, I'm going to fail out of college. Well, obviously, they're not going to fail out of college with one missed test. But if they allow that failure to keep them from turning in other materials, if they allow that irrational belief to affect the rest of their semester or the rest of their college career, then of course that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm sorry, I was trying to talk too fast. But another subtype is a low conscientiousness and low neuroticism. So they don't have a lot of anxiety, and high extroversion. So these are more likely to procrastinate without the worry. They just had a party, it'll be all right, I'll pick it up next time. And they also avoid tasks that they consider unpleasant and prefer to engage in more satisfying pursuits. But they don't do that because they're adverse to failure. They just do that because something else is more interesting. And People who are high in extroversion like to party. They like to be around people. They like to be involved in activities. And so they're not as concerned about failure. And so with them, you would have to find a very different motivator. Some studies have also identified a rebellious type of procrastinator, and they're just resisting authority and trying to assert their independence through procrastinating or putting off things. So, in counseling situations, um, you do need to take care to um, not try to fit every procrastinator into the same box or even into one of these types that we've talked about. I mean, let's be honest, most of us have avoided things we didn't want to do, and sometimes it's just in one area of our life, but not the other. Some of us may hate to go to a dentist, but that doesn't mean that you procrastinate in your homework or that you procrastinate at your job. And some people may procrastinate in their home life, but not procrastinate in their job. So, um, research does seem to suggest, though, that there are developmental reasons for procrastination at this stage of this young adult stage of life. And the skills of decision making and self management are honed in identity development process. And so maybe part of that is because they have not um, developed that identity. This is actually kind of a process that happens at about the same time as entry into college or military service or turning 18 and going to work. Um, so how do we treat it as health professionals other than what I've already mentioned? The behavioral approaches, such as instruction and time management and organizational skills, are very important, especially to the second subtype with the high extroversion. Um, these techniques are really useful in helping students learn to segment tasks into manageable components. And really, we're talking about this at the young adult stage, but it is never too young to start teaching children to do this on their own. And I believe that we would see a lot less problem with this in young adulthood if they learned it much younger. So, so that might be a skill that they should start learning as young as possible to segment those tasks into some kind of manageable components and start teaching them to develop timelines and benchmarks for task completion. By this week, I'm going to have this much done, and or by this day, and then provide themselves with some regular um, feedback about their own performance. So, are they staying on task? And sometimes it may take the counselor to ensure, to have them self reflect on, are they staying on task? Are these time management skills working for them? Do they need to be revised? And some other approaches blend those behavioral components. Those behavioral components tend to be a big part of any work with children or adults who are dealing with these time management and procrastination issues. But some of them may have specific components that address those underlying psychological needs that include some self-reflection and some stress management. REBT techniques are very popular in a lot of these counseling sessions because they are so effective. And if you're not familiar with REBT, you will learn about that in theories class and probably in many of the other classes throughout this program. Or you could Google it now and be ahead of the ball game. REBT is really a good, um, has some good techniques that are very helpful. So some of the current research and writings have actually suggested that overparenting, or what most of us call helicopter parenting, which is really intended to prevent failure in adult children, may actually be a huge part of the problem rather than the solution. So you know those parents who come in every semester and want to figure out their children's schedule for them and want to fill out all the college forms for their children and want to do all of these things, and that just follows them on into young adulthood. And so overparenting of young adult children can include things like providing excessive advice, um, emotional overinvolvement in their children's lives, showing hypervigilance to make sure that nothing bad happens to them. There's going to be some bad things that happen to us all in life. And that's part of learning who we are. There's going to be some failures for all of us in life, and those things are important. And so when they don't allow those things to happen, it can be a problem. And also the anticipation of potential problems, which we just talked about, controlling the young person's sense of self-direction. It's very important that they be allowed to develop their own sense of self-direction. And then, of course, offering excessive money, goods, and any kind of tangible resources, even time can be an issue. So overparenting is linked with many problematic behaviors and outcomes for young adults. And I think there's a table, 11.2, it tells you right here on the slide, that outlines the outcomes associated with overparenting. And it's definitely worth a quick look. And more important, table 11.3 on page 452 shows a model of stages in counselor development, and they definitely are worth the time, the few minutes that it would take to read through those. So I suggest that you do that if at all possible. And so we're not going to spend a lot of times on development psychopathology at this age, but I do want to mention that depression is very rampant, I guess, during this age, and it seems to be kind of on a spectrum. So in one end of that spectrum, you may see where they're just depressed all the time. And then at the other end, you may see bipolar depression. And you're going to talk about this a lot more when you get into psychopathology and treatment planning. But in the bipolar disorder, they're manic for a time where they may just produce all kinds of wonderful things. You know, we've had some of our most famous artists who suffered from bipolar disorder. And so when they were in that manic stage, they don't need much sleep. They can just work. And then when they enter the flip side of that bipolar disorder and become depressed, they may not be able to get out of bed for days. They may not brush their teeth for weeks. They just become very, very depressed. So they're either one or the other. And depression is the world's second most costly disease. They frequently coexist with other illnesses, and the rates are rising, and there's higher rates in females than there are in males. And remember, we talked about in adolescence that might be because of coping styles where females were more likely to ruminate. We don't know what causes depression. It is associated with neurotransmitter systems, and that's why many times medical doctors will treat depression and or bipolar disorder because they feel like there's a chemical imbalance, and so they will give them medication to balance that. There's a lot of times that actually presents in childhood, that we see the depression, and then adolescence is a big time for seeing bipolar disorder in adolescents come out in adults. Most of the time they will see that before young adulthood, although some does happen during adulthood. And then the stressors in adulthood can precipitate the emergence of depression in people who had not previously experienced it, but who may have some kind of vulnerability, whether it's genetic or otherwise. And so there are a lot of treatments. Most of the time today, we see pharmacological, some kind of medication, but CBT has also worked well. And then some some mindfulness based cognitive therapies have also worked well, particularly with young adults. So I'm going to end this here, and I appreciate your time listening to this. And I do hope that you will enjoy learning about young adulthood. From here on out, the stages that you're going to learn about may or may not be stages that you've progressed through yet. So even if you don't feel like they're of use for the students that you're going to work with, you probably will have parents that are in these stages. But also, I think that they're very helpful for us to know what to expect. For instance, if you're in this young adulthood stage, you may not have thought about the decisions that you're making right now affecting you when you're 50, 60 years old. Poor eating habits resulting in high blood pressure and diabetes, lack of exercise, resulting in low bone density and other things. I actually think that this is a course that everybody should take. And so I hope that you guys enjoy it as much as I do and benefit from it.